好吧，我们照例先学习啊，先学1个小时。我们拜请维基百科，我们拜请拉黑字幕组，精神分析穿越幻想之神。
A series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video offers a summary of Jacques Lacan's Seminar 2. If you've already watched most of the videos of this seminar, some of this may be review, but the content is approached from a wider lens, considering individual concepts in light of the whole. For those who have not watched all the other videos, this might be a helpful introduction to the seminar before diving deeper into the individual lectures. As I did for Seminar 1, I'll condense this summary into 10 distinct ideas I believe Seminar 2 provides. This list is not intended to be definitive nor comprehensive. As I was reviewing notes I've made, I noticed connections that eluded me previously and realized how Schema L, in a more elaborated form, can be used as an anchoring point for these 10 ideas. So let's begin by naming the 4 corners of Schema L, with the subject in the upper left, the ego in the lower left, the alter ego or little other in the upper right, and the big other in the lower right. As we proceed, we'll situate each of the 10 ideas within the schema. Lacan elaborates upon the real more in Seminar 2 than he does in Seminar 1. I'm representing the real here by the black background because it's unnameable, lacking any possible mediation. Lacan calls it absolutely without fissure, meaning it precedes the differences, the presences and absences that mark the symbolic. It's
它没有 fissure 什么意思？因为它本身就是那个 fissure。这个就是褶子，褶子它就是这个意思，就是那个陶老师现在不是叫褶子吗？就这个意思，就是后结构主义的主体性就是一个褶子。所以拉康后期转向到那个拓扑学了，因为他觉得拓扑学能把这个关系言说出来。
fundamentally unnameable, so we can only talk about it in terms of the failures of the imaginary and symbolic. Because once we start making positive attributions of it, those attributions themselves belong to the symbolic. Take, for instance, the exact sciences. These sciences attempt to get at the real, much like how myths and religions had previously done. They deploy a small number of symbols, like E equals mc squared, and other equations that project the structure onto the real, rather than bringing us in direct contact with it. Interestingly, and this is something Zizek has pointed out, the laws established by the exact sciences, such as physics, when pushed to their limit, start to break down, perhaps exemplified by the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Zizek somewhat humorously states that it's as if God had only expected humans to get so far, and so created a symbolic universe that wasn't intended to be surpassed. Still, humans surpassed it, and then God was like, oh shit, because once you break past the limit of the symbolic set up by the big other, you get utter chaos and meaninglessness. It's the point in which the laws of physics break down. At those moments in which the symbolic does break down, we get a glimpse of the real. And this is also the case at the level of the subject when it's confronted with the terrifying organicity of the bodily real, such as when Freud looks down Irma's throat in his dreams. It serves as a kind of trauma, and will be a notion that we'll return to in these seminars. The exact sciences are just an example of a more prominent feature of the symbolic, which is its being like a machine or perhaps a computer algorithm. I like the metaphor of the algorithm because it's highly relevant to our present-day context. The algorithm is programmed with a specific set of laws that determines what happens. So perhaps the algorithm bases its decisions on clicks and watch time. And as a result, some content gets elevated while other content becomes hidden. What is most notable here is how the algorithm, after it's established, begins to take on a life of its own in ways that the programmers didn't anticipate. It's devoid of human decision-making, and consequently, we now have an algorithm promoting content that just so happens to appeal to some of the more base elements of humanity, leading to, at times, devastating effects. Lacan illustrates this function of the algorithm in Seminar 2 using the game of odds and evens, or pluses and minuses, whereby a symbolic system introduces a certain amount of necessity into the game of chance. The automaticity of the symbolic demonstrates that we're not dealing with a human world, and this symbolic is itself absolutely irreducible to human experience. At the same time, the symbolic is also a source of creation. It gives rise to the universe. That is, the order and structure that makes meaning possible. Once a subject arrives, it integrates itself into this discourse. And when something new is introduced into the symbolic, it brings that thing into being and retroactively makes it as though it had always existed. Just like when we discovered gravity, it became so obvious and necessary that upon its discovery, it strikes us as always already having been there since the beginning of time. This retroactive effect characterizes symbolic memory. Though the symbolic itself is irreducible to human experience, a human dimension does come to intersect with it, introducing an impurity into an otherwise uninterrupted, closed signifying chain. Now, one element of this algorithm starts to take itself into account. As we saw when it comes to Gödel's incompleteness theorem, we run into all sorts of contradictions once a number set begins to take itself into account. In the context of the symbolic, this point of contradiction is where we find the subject. The subject is both a link within the signifying chain and that element discordant with the rest of the symbolic universe. The subject gets tangled into the wires of the symbolic network, extracting from the symbolic a piece that plays a critical role in supporting the unique positioning of that subject within the symbolic. The subject is also described as an atom of concrete discourse and the historical embodiment of the universal discourse of language. The symbolic itself is a language, but a mute one. The subject is the one who speaks this language. And it's at the level of speech that the subject is made manifest. And it's through speech that meaning is given to the pre-existing but undeciphered laws of that universal discourse. This function of speech gives a meaning by naming, thereby delivering to the subject its history. Now, this subject I've just described is not entirely equivalent to the unconscious subject, but we need to pass through a few other figures first to arrive there. This symbolic realization of the subject is also where one finds a relation to the big other. In some ways, the big other is equivalent to the symbolic itself, but more concretely, it's the subject's particular relation to the symbolic. It's both another subject and the symbolic order that mediates the subject's relation to other subjects. The laws of the symbolic take on a particular meaning for this subject so that it's not necessarily representative of the entirety of the law that governs the symbolic. This element of the law is what seems to be called the superego, which is a misrecognition of the law. Censorship, which is closely related to the superego, is the law representative of the entire meaning for this relation to other subjects. And it's the subject there is also where one finds a relation to the big other. In some ways, the big other is equivalent to the symbolic itself, but more concretely, it's the subject's particular relation to the symbolic. It's both another subject and the symbolic order that mediates the subject's relation to other subjects. It's the subject's particular equivalent to the symbolic itself, but more concretely, it's the subject's particular relation to the symbolic. It's both another subject and the symbolic order that mediates the subject's relation to other subjects. The laws of the symbolic.
这里补充一下，拉康在晚期把这里分开了，就是 symbolic 是分两个的，就 S1 跟 S2 嘛。然后他刚才前面讲的那个，就是说语言的结构、语法的结构，那个是属于 S2 的，然后这个禁令的部分属于 S1 的。怎么说呢？这个 S1、S2 吧，只是拉康提出的一些概念啊，但事实上这里其实听起来也是有问题的。但是我是目前是没什么能力想一个更好的。但是我的意思是，他这里这些概念其实也是一个发展的过程。如果他真的能活个，他如果再能活他个100年，他也许能整明白。但是我是整不明白了。但是我只是跟你说，他这里这个 S1、S2 这里其实还是有问题的。
take on a particular meaning for the subject so that it's not necessarily representative of the entirety of the law that governs the symbolic. This element of the law is what seems to be called the superego, which is a misrecognition of the law. Censorship, which is closely related to the superego, is the law insofar as it is not understood, and insofar as it is never in relation with the law in its entirety. The subject is in the position then of trying to figure out what this enigmatic big other wants. This big other is a radical alterity. It goes entirely beyond the imaginary other and can in no way be understood on the level of the ego. It's important to recall that the I, the subject, is integrated into the symbolic, a link in the larger chain of signifiers. The unconscious in its totality is not merely the unrecognized dimension of the subject, but also the unrecognized dimension of the symbolic as a whole. And herein we come to find the particular instantiation of the big other in its relationship to the subject. That relationship expresses itself as a kind of symbolic discourse. It's not the discourse with an abstract other, but it's, for instance, a discourse with one's father or other symbolic figures that represent the law of the symbolic to that subject. To understand the relationship this big other has with the subject, we must first appreciate how the other's discourse passes through what's called the wall of language, which means we need to take up the imaginary and, more specifically, the ego. The story of the subject that I've told so far has been chiefly situated at the level of the symbolic itself. However, we also can approach it starting from the imaginary constitution of the subject. In some sense, this leads us to a point already.
我跟你们讲，你们不要觉得学这个东西很难，这个东西当然很难。你们现在学这个东西，其实跟学魔法是一样的。你之前掌握这个东西，就你们掌握的虽然不好，你们也是见习魔法师。
Addressed in the summary of Seminar 1 regarding the developmental unfolding of the ego. So if I were to tell a story about the life of the subject starting from the living organism, it might go something like this. Once upon a time, there was an animal who had a crack and profound disturbance in its ability to maintain homeostasis. All the other animals acted like jammed machines, possessing a restricted range of possible responses, beholden to environmental variations. Those animals could regulate themselves well under most circumstances. However, this cracked animal could not. It was a misfit in its environment. So the biological rhythms of its body in response to the environment could not wholly determine it. Consequently, the cracked animal began to look outside of itself, trying to fill this crack with whatever it could find. But what object could fill this crack? Which object could make it whole again? And in this search, it discovers an object that delivers a momentary semblance of unity. And the animal declares, now this here is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, and we shall become one. Here forms the imaginary relation, which delivers to this cracked animal its semblance of unity in the form of the ego. And herein we might give a meaning to the notion that I is an other. But this is an imaginary other, forming part of a narcissistic relation.
他这里讲的不行啊，他这里讲的完全是弗洛伊德的思路。当然不是这样的了，就是过程是也许是这样的，就是说当然是在这个进化过程，但是是随着语言的发展啊，并不是他这个说的什么随着什么生物，不是这是随着语言。因为我们说这个动物，比如说动物有没有掌握这个就是符号系统好了，有些动物有某种程度的符号系统，比如他们之前说乌鸦很聪明，你记不记得我们一起看哪个？乌鸦肯定是有的，猫也是有的，狗也是有的，更低级的动物是没有的。他们那些叫声什么的，就是某些能指系统的一部分，他们只掌握这部分。就是说这个肯定是随着符号系统的发展，而不是随着这个就是说什么什么这个动物什么生存中什么遇到什么问题，不是那种生物进化论的观点。就它也是也不叫进化了。四川不结婚登记孩子什么意思？我们先看完这个，讲完这个再聊实证的事情。这里这个问题我想看怎么跟你们讨论这个问题啊。就是死，其实事实上就是死亡这个概念，就是动物是不知道自己会死亡的，或者是他知道自己会死亡， 啊，他不知道，因为死亡其实就是一个能指的概念了。动物事实上是就是说它没有死亡这种概念了，因为动物的这个没有欲望嘛，就是它的这个需求跟它的这个就 demand 的要求跟它的这个需求之间没有那个分裂，就是没有一个超出的东西，所以它不能理解死亡这个概念。就是比如说什么蚂蚁啊，什么昆虫什么之类的，对吧？它不能理解这个能指，就是或者是在他们的符号系统中，他们没有这个能指。但是有些动物是有的，就是什么动物呢？就是能了解同类的死亡的动物是有的。就比如说猫跟狗妈妈是会，就是猫妈妈如果它孩子冻死了，它是会对着孩子的尸体哭的。就是它就只有在这种情况下你才知道动物是了解了死亡。其实只有了解了死亡，你才能有一些粗略的这个能指的结构。所以说就是有些动物显然是没有，但有些动物显然是有的。对，什么大西洋猫狗或者是什么鸟类很聪明那种肯定是有的。但是再往前面那种就对那个同类的尸体的就是死亡无动于衷那些就是没有。所以说它这个也是一个怎么说呢，就是语言发展的过程嘛，能指发展的过程。通过这个能指发展的过程，它才能逐渐就是产生欲望什么之类的东西。
And situated at the level of the libidinal and the pleasure principle. This unity, being fleeting and imaginary, was not to last. Division and discord began to emerge as the object of desire oscillated between unity and disarray, and evoked vacillations between love and hatred within the imaginary relation, a relation infected with a fundamental uncertainty. And therein came a third, to establish peace among the discordant factions. That third is the symbolic, which was always already there from the beginning. It now begins to structure the object, delivering to it a kind of stability and permanence, and the capacity to gain mastery over its presences and absences. The absent object can now be made present by a signifier. That signifier mediates the ego and the imaginary other's relationship to the object, allowing for an agreement to recognize the same object, wherein symbolic exchange can now replace the imaginary mode of relating. This ability to conjure the object symbolically is structured by a tendency to repeat. This repetitive insistence allows the object to be reestablished across innumerable situations. And so the lost object, which is made present only by a signifier, can be allowed to persist by symbolically reinstantiating the conditions necessary for it to be made present once again. What is the relationship between repetition and the death drive? Repetition is the insistence of what does not exist and is beyond the ego who operates according to the pleasure principle. This insistence entails that which is beyond imaginary relations, rational motivations, beyond feelings or any attempt to maintain the status quo that would preserve a kind of homeostasis. The death drive, thus, is what renders us incapable of ever being satisfied or ever landing at a place of contentment for too long. The death drive is the beyond of being itself, and instead is that which is in the process of becoming, insisting on being realized, but currently is not recognized as such. Now, in light of this notion of the death drive, I made a connection with the idea of the cracked animal. But in Seminar 1, there is addressed this notion of a gap.
这里很难啊，我知道你们听起来其实这里是什么叫做重复转抄？说这里很难啊。其实这里如果你能理解，就能理解拉康最有名的那一篇，就是对大众来说比较熟的那一篇，就康德同萨德，因为这一篇涉及到伦理学、美学的问题嘛。就是说交叉学科研究的比较多，如果这里你能听懂，你都能懂那个康德同萨德什么意思。
Gap created between the image of oneself as a bodily unity and the reality of one's state of bodily impotence that results from a premature birth and an underdeveloped nervous system. Consequently, Lacan stated in that seminar that humans are not able to then apply frameworks that allow us to fit within our environments neatly. However, after going through this seminar, I've come to wonder if that gap, or as I've been calling it here, that crack, is in some way a product of the death drive itself, which is why the human animal is the one animal always seeking to go beyond the pleasure principle. The explanation provided in Seminar 1 makes more sense if we believe the symbolic emerges following this earliest point of human development. However, we've also come to see how the symbolic precedes us. In some ways, the subject is already there before our births, and that we are, in many ways, born into a symbolic structure before the explicit acquisition of language. In this sense, perhaps the death drive is there always already with us, and as such is in part responsible for making us the odd animals that we are. Making us
这里比较难啊，但你没想到那么多，所以这里不讲了，算了。
The odd animals that we are. This now raises another question.
我们还有6分钟，听完了我可以给大家浅讲一下这个那个康德同萨德这篇文章。
What exactly is this insistence seeking to realize? It reproduces the object symbolically, but why? It's because it's trying to realize an unrecognized desire, which has been repressed. This brings us to the unconscious subject. The unconscious subject is that dimension of the subject that is excluded and unable to be integrated into the existing status quo of the pleasure principle, as its inclusion introduces a radical imbalance, which is perhaps why it was repressed in the first place. So how does the ego fit in here vis-a-vis the unconscious subject? It must be kept in mind that the ego is what I have received from outside myself and have erroneously identified as the totality of who I am, excluding everything else that is part of the subject. The ego is the object of the subject, but an object so hypnotically enticing that it becomes the fundamental central structure of the subject's experience. As such, the ego remains part of the subject, but leads to an absolute dissymmetry and radical difference within what is now a split subject, one split between the unconscious subject and the ego. Positioned in this manner, the ego functions as an interruption in the concrete discourse between the subject and big other. This is because the subject's identification with the ego in its imaginary relation with the other forms a wall of language that filters the message leading from the big other to the subject in such a way as to distort it and redirect it to seemingly aim at the imaginary other. Consequently, the subject does not know what the big other is saying, and the subject doesn't know what it is saying. It's also the case that the subject doesn't even realize that it's actually addressing the big other, but instead believes it's addressing this imaginary other. The big other delivers its message to the subject in an aberrant form of a commandment, and the subject in turn, speaking through its ego, speaks back to this big other, but now in a disguised and distorted form. So the discourse between egos is a misrecognized form of the discourse between the subject and the big other. For this reason, I don't know what I'm saying, since I'm saying one thing but meaning another thing. You might believe we are addressing the one who is in fact this imaginary mirage. Still, the repetitive insistence of
他这里讲的也不太好啊，其实，并不是说你怎么说，就是说你在说一个事情，然后你实际上意思是另外一个事情，不是，这个都是回溯性的，就是你在说什么，你的意思是什么，其实你的就是说听你说话的人比你是知道的更多的。
The unconscious subject continues to aim its message at the big other, and this comes in the form of the mistake, a slip of the tongue, the forgetting of a word, etc. With all this in mind, we can now think about neurosis. Neurosis now means that something of the discourse going from the big other to the subject is not allowed to pass through. Nonetheless, this discourse, which is resisted, insists through the corporeal support of the subject, whereby it gets expressed as symptoms. So symptoms are the inverse side of this discourse, a repetitive insistence seeking to realize itself in a redirected form. How this looks depends on the kind of neurosis and how the subject is specifically positioned vis-a-vis the big other. Lacan doesn't say much about hysteria in this seminar, but he does address obsessional neurosis on occasion. He calls this form of neurosis the fatal influence of the ego taken to a maximum, as the subject is bound to its ego more than in any other form of neurosis. Through this complete alienation, the subject constantly objectifies itself, distancing itself from its desire so as to please the big other, which the obsessive constantly seeks to prop up, but at the expense of misrecognizing other subjects, including oneself. The goal of analysis is true speech, which aims at joining the subject to the other by overcoming the wall of language and discovering which other the subject is truly addressing. Progress in analysis consists of a gradual displacement of the imaginary relation with the symbolic one through speech that names what's been repressed. This true speech transpires through transference. That is, the speech directed at the big other, while the subject understands itself as addressing the analyst's ego. Analysts, in turn, must learn to suspend their egos to take up the position of the big other rather than their own ego. They must render themselves opaque and enigmatic to the analysand, thereby approximating the radical alterity of the big other. Doing so facilitates the transference in analysis. In that position, analysts get to know what the subject is saying, who it's speaking to, and identify the imaginary character of what is being said. So here's a question that I'll leave you with. What happens to the subject when it's not properly structured by the symbolic? In other words, what if the big other, this figure of the law that concretely binds us to the symbolic, is in some way an absentee father rather than merely an oppressive, menacing figure? We'll take up this question in Seminar 3, addressing Lacan's conceptualization of psychosis. I want to thank the following for supporting this channel on Patreon.
好，鼓掌。第二期研讨班我们也学完了，每次听完了。第二期也是1950几年讲的，我就觉得拉康真的是个天才。但是拉康也不是个天才，他讲的东西也是在就是前人研究的那个，就怎么说呢？就你生在东亚学起这些东西来就是比较困难。但是事实上，拉康能想到这些东西，就跟他生在法国也是关系比较大的。为什么？现在那些优秀哲学家，德勒兹什么德里达是法国人吧，都是法国人。那些法国人他就是有这种传统。对呀，我现在马上要给你们讲的这个康德，就是说，比如说我们讲这个精神分析伦理学，为什么拉康能想出来？那还是因为前面有萨德嘛，有萨德这个逼嘛。萨德这个逼为了跟这个德国人康德抬杠，康德不是什么伦理学革命嘛，就说什么道德律令、普遍道德准则嘛。然后拉康更逗，然后那个萨德那本书叫《闺房里的哲学》嘛，其实是寝室，那个闺房就是说卧室，然后他们觉得中文里翻译成卧室有点那个不太正式吧，他们翻译成闺房，其实就是卧室。弑父娶母是弗洛伊德，天哪，你连萨德是谁都不知道吗？然后萨德写那本书就叫《闺房里的哲学》，其实就卧室里的哲学。然后拉康就说那个。就说萨德说的这个东西才是真正的哲学。他说康德是类似，康德是什么蛇皮玩意儿？康德说的东西纯粹都是错的。然后他就管那个萨德那个说那个卧室叫做就是真正的雅典学院。我们店里画那个挂画不是雅典学院吗？然后他的意思真正雅典学院就是那个叫什么？萨德的那个卧室。我说这些你们听得懂什么意思吗？就是所谓的精神分析伦理学革命到底是什么？就是这个齐德克也老会说嘛，他就会说那个就是 the big other 的禁令，或者是那个就是那人叫什么康德说的那个什么什么 super ego 那些东西，道德律令到底是什么？齐德克不天天说那个就是 the obscene other 嘛，就是那个淫荡的，他天天说那个东西是淫荡的嘛，就是那个东西为什么是淫荡的？是这个问题，就康德那个普遍道德律令的问题到底在哪里？因为那仍然是一种就是说阳具中心逻辑嘛，对吧？男性性的逻辑、强迫症的逻辑、阳具至上的爹味儿逻辑，就是说你应该怎么做，你应该怎么做，然后有某种普遍化的道德律令。然后康德他为了避免这个形而上学的主观客观的问题，他写的第二本就是实践理性批判嘛，他说是。因为从这个实践什么类似某种这个实用啊什么功利主义的什么幸福最大化的就最为普遍化的角度来考虑这些问题，原则性考虑问题，不考虑一些病态的 pathological 的个别的后果。然后他就会说这个对说的很好，给你发一个黄管，就是追求这个胜于原乐 fallacy 原乐的逻辑，就是他说就是说法律好了，那根据康德的观念，当然这个资本主义需要一种法律对吧？资本主义法权，这个法律应该是一种就作为普遍性的原则对吧？但是萨德就指出，在他这个闺房里哲学，他就说你这个就普遍性的法律，就是说你这个法律其实是最荒谬的东西，因为你比如说 普遍性嘛，对吧？普遍性是什么？任何人都拥有自主权，对吧？任何人是不能被任何人拥有的，所以一个女人也不可能被任何一个男人拥有，对吧？我们就说普遍化，最普遍化的情况下，一个女人也不能被另外一个男人所拥有，对不对？所以女人就应当是男性的，就是公共的就追求的对象，对不对？因为你要最大化嘛，你就不考虑个别的就是说造成的损害，没有考虑总体的绝对的那种情况的话，那任何一个女人，她因为人生而拥有自由嘛，就是人拥有什么自由的平等的权利，这是最普遍的原则，对吧？那女人应当拥有这种权利，那一个女人她就不应该是任何男人的所有物，就是她的身体权跟她的这个就是她身体的所有权始终是属于她自己，她性的自主权同样也是如此，因此她应该是可以被所有的那个男人享用的。然后与此同时呢，根据这种什么人生而什么绝对的什么自由平等的原则，对吧？那么每个人都应该享有平等的享用权，对不对？享用权呢，就举个例子说，比如说广场的喷泉好了，所有权当然不是平等，但享用权是平等，对不对？所有人都可以享用这个喷泉。因此呢，你依照这些原则往下推，那么所有的这个男人都有权享用所有的女人。所以说他觉得应该，而且他据此逻辑又说康德这些东西嘛，他说那你也应该允许乱伦啊，因为乱伦普遍来看是扩展了什么什么家庭的亲缘关系，总体上增进了什么什么社会的什么和谐稳定。他说你还要允许什么什么谋杀，他谋杀也不应当因此负责，因为你有权利被别人杀，那么你也有权利杀别人。反正他就大概就是说，康德这个什么那些什么普遍道德律令，这个普遍，他最后在实践中只会造成非常荒谬的结果，没有什么普遍化的东西，所以他就一直很黑色幽默调侃这个问题嘛。所以可见，就是康德这个什么道德律令，什么这种什么绝对化、普遍化的这个逻辑，这逻辑是什么？不就是阳具享乐吗？就他排除出去了一些例外了，构成这个所谓的什么什么平等、什么自由、什么公平这些东西嘛。萨德他没有这么聪明，但是他隐隐约他感觉到这个问题，而且事实上，萨德黑色幽默指出这个事实是所有人都知道，这就是意识形态嘛。所有人当然也都知道，就是说这个法律其实是不公平的，对不对？它其实只是统治者的这个意志了，始终是有些人被排除出去的，就是这个社会的剩余，对不对？那些精神病、底层人士、难民、游牧、弱势群体，对吧？始终是被这个社会的主流话语排除在外的。就萨德老早就就是他就只是指出这个事实，其实大家对此都是心知肚明的嘛。所以拉康在这里就指出了这个问题嘛，就是说以这种普遍性的话语，然后来树立的某些权威 the other， 就是这些禁令，所有的这些东西是什么？这个东西其实就是对阳具享乐的。所以这个那人叫什么？那个齐泽克管是 opposite the other 嘛 ，the opposite other。然后那么精神分析的伦理学是什么？精神分析伦理学就是最后那个拉康就指出了这个问题，他就指出了说应该如何做，他记得二期圣状才指出这个问题，那就是成为一个女人。听不懂是吧？拉康早期的思考就是安提戈涅了，简单来说就是犯病就是不要在欲望上让步，就是这句话中文翻译始终是有问题的。就比如说不要对你的欲望让步，就是说一定要得到你想要的东西，这个是这个翻译是有问题的，是不是这个意思？法语是不要在欲望上让步，就是说要始终去欲望，要始终去就是坚持一个你想要的东西，就是这个世界上不用就是说你要突破那个淫荡的享乐的禁令的幻想嘛，突破那种原父的幻想，不是追求不满足，你不还是追求不满足，不就是陷入欲望的辩证法吗？你还是没明白不要在欲望上让步是什么意思？不要在欲望上让步，恰恰是要接受创伤，也不是接受吧？我想该怎么说这个问题呢？因为伦理学跟美学是连着的嘛。伦理学什么意思？我昨儿不是讲美学讲过一点点吗？就讲那个安提戈涅，对吧？就是善和美的问题。美学的发生学其实就是伦理学了。伦理学是什么意思啊？伦理学的意思是一种理想的图示，就是应当如何做，对吧？伦理学不是说你需要怎么做，你就是说你必须怎么做，因为那个不是伦理学考虑的问题。伦理学考虑的问题是什么？是理想的模式，就是你应当怎样，你应然是怎样的，考虑这个问题。然后精神分析的伦理学就是反对这个新康德主义的所谓的应然，就是说 你应当是怎么样的，就是没有你应当是怎么样的没有人能告诉你你应当是怎么样的。如果有某种标准，第二的标准来告诉你你应当是怎么样的，那就是某种这个父权制式的。我跟你说，这个思想是相当之激进，以至于很少人会认真来讨论它这个伦理学的问题，因为它这个其实是比那个萨德那个还要更激进的。然后这个东西以至于激进到就是任何的统治者都容不下这样的话语，所以他这个精神分析伦理学他也很少去讨论这个问题。那如果你们想再明白一下这个问题，我只能跟你们说，因为这个东西我没办法宣之于口，作为某种这个公共人物，安纳奇算什么呀？安纳奇不是还是保留着一个美好的维度吗？安纳奇不是还保留着我们什么生而平等自由吗？安纳奇才是最大的我说那个阳具享乐吧。安纳奇不就是我们生是平等自由的吗？我们反对一切什么什么之类的吗？如果你们想了解这个问题，可以去看那个，就是我们之前看那电影看一半，什么巴德尔集团或者是重信房子，我只能说这么多了，我不能再多说了。反正 anyway 你们就能明白他这个精神分析伦理学的这个激进之处了，我就不敢再多说了，因为任何建制化就是容不下这个东西的。但是他在闺房里的哲学倒没有讨论到这么多的东西了，他只是大概说一下，就是说就康德这种东西，它其实不过是很小宝宝的什么什么那些东西之类的。但是我们不讲那种很大的东西啊，我们就讲这种就是说个人的东西，主体的，不讲那种比较大的东西。在主体方面其实就是很简单，其实就是你要识别出在你的这个 ego 在这个自我的结构中，它同样是分裂的，你要能在其中把那个禁令识别出来。你把这个禁令一旦把这个禁令识别出来，你就可以进行某种就是说分析师式的话语了。因为分析师话语跟这个议政话语都是某种这个具有进步性的话语嘛。然后等你穿越这个幻想的时候，但你仍然会具有症状因为症状就是强迫重复嘛，它还是会回去的。症状是会存在的，只不过这个症状就从一种无知的激情的症状，盲目的欲望，变成了一种真正的就是具有解放性的，可以向死而生的激情。你只想哭，你就应该哭呀，你就应该只想哭呀，你也没认真学习过呀。你自己每天有认真学习这些东西吗？你有认真进行这些思考吗？你都没有认真思考过你的人生，天天就搁这儿看直播发弹幕玩游戏，你不想哭谁想哭呀？你就是还是淹没在种种那种保护性的幻想中，没有彻底认识到你人生这种孤独而无助的状态吗？被抛入的状态吗？那你本来你就只能想哭呀你也不配干别的呀。精神分析它所戳破那些幻想，不过就是这些你仍然在追求这个阳具享乐，编织那种享乐性的。为什么幻想难以穿越？是因为幻想都是享乐性的嘛，它把你留在那里就是依靠这种享乐嘛。包括你想哭也是一种享乐，就停在这个创伤里面，就不想改变，不想承认，其实自己都已经知道，就这个世界它就是这样子的。但凡是能清醒的认识到这个问题的，都已经行动起来了，都已经去开始请客吃饭交朋友了。你啥都不干，那你当然只想哭呀，后边还有的哭呢，不要着急。最后也没成事儿，那啥叫成事儿呀？你人生是为了成事儿吗？那你现在成了什么事儿了吗？你这辈子能成什么事儿吗？你这辈子可能就是个拧螺丝的呀，因为你学这些东西你也学不会啊，你最后的实践也不可能有什么结果。那照你这么说，你人生也没什么意义了，你也没成事啊，那你为什么要活着？你竟然评价别人成没成事儿，我的天哪！那你这个跟刚才我们说那个什么普遍性原则什么阳具享乐有什么区别啊？你跟别人觉得你又穷又没钱不配活的，只配当分母有什么区别啊？你爸妈也天天觉得你没用吗？废物啥一事无成呀？你对这个事情评价跟他们对你的评价不是一样的吗？